Dr. Martin, then you have found her, and we'll get started in just a minute with our formal webinar. So, yeah. Well, maybe we'll go ahead and get started because I always want to reward promptness. So always excited when my students show up to class exactly on time. So welcome everybody to Food Systems Friday. And this is a webinar organized by the Sustainable Food Systems faculty at Prescott College. And I'm Robin Curry. I'm the director of both our bachelor's and master of science in sustainable food systems, and our master's program, and also our part of our bachelor's programs are available online. And for our master's program, it's an intentionally online program because we really are wanting to support students and their efforts to build more sustainable food systems in their own communities. So in March of 2020, we launched Food Systems Fridays to support all of you in your efforts in your own communities to transform food systems. The onset of the COVID pandemic made food systems inequities worse and more visible. And food banks and pantries experienced an unprecedented number of guests as more people encountered hardships that made self-sufficiency a challenge. And so for those of you who've been joining us for the last year, you know that we focus on policies, practices, and people who can show us and help us learn about models for more sustainable food systems and more sustainable communities. And this is especially true of our guest today. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Katie Martin. Dr. Martin is the Executive Director of FoodShare's Institute for Hunger Research and Solutions at Connecticut Food Bank-Foodshare. And Dr. Martin will be speaking with us today about food insecurity and the charitable food systems, lessons learned during COVID-19. So welcome, Dr. Martin.
It is my pleasure to be here. So happy to be with you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so this is in some ways a celebration of an accomplishment and actually a privilege for a lot of us to have the opportunity to learn more about the charitable food system. And so I wanted to let you all know that that Dr. Martin's new book just came out. And so it's called Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries. And so we're going to be learning about some of the things that she discusses about food banks and food pantries in that book during our webinar today. So we're popping into the chat the link to her publisher site. It's an Island Press book. And she very generously has let us know about a discount opportunity for those of you who have turned in live. So she'll be popping that into the chat. Also joining us today is my colleague here at Prescott College, Dr. Wendy Sue Harper. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so Wendy Sue will be helping facilitate the chat and fielding questions and, back up just in case the inevitable connection glitch happens, as has been known to happen. But I also wanted to let you all know that the next episode of Food Systems Friday will be airing at the same time on May 21st. And it's entitled Every Drop Counts, Agricultural Water Reuse Advances from the Conserve Center. And so we'll be welcoming the executive director, Dr. Amy Sapkota, Dr. Kent Messer, and also Dr. Rachel Rosenberg Goldstein. So when I was meeting with Dr. Sapkota, one of the things she said that they research is like the ick factor of what people's perceptions are about water reuse in agriculture. But, our freshwater resources are a critical threat actually to ongoing food security across the world. So we're looking forward to having that conversation. So as usual, having registered for the webinar, you'll receive details and the links for the very next one. So welcome. And those of you, if you're catching this on the recording, please feel free to just search for us either on YouTube or on our landing page. So Food Systems Fridays at Prescott College. Now, we are at our 1-year anniversary. So we're so pleased that Dr. Martin's here to celebrate that with us. But we would also love to hear from all of you. So I have an ask, as we look for, as we're moving into year 2, the ask is that we would really like to incorporate your ideas and any suggestions that you have for us about where you'd like for us to take this series moving forward. So we really look forward to hearing your thoughts and suggestions for future webinars and guests. And please self-nominate yourself because we would really like to hear from you. So we're popping a quick survey link into the chat. And those of you who are watching the recording, it will also have the link there right under the YouTube video and on our landing page for Food Systems Friday. So we're really looking forward to continuing to have this be a meaningful time and also contributing further to transforming our food system. So thank you so much for taking the time to participate in that survey, and we'll pop the link in again towards the end. So I do want to let you know that we are recording the webinar. We make this webinar freely available on our website, on YouTube, for folks who just simply aren't able to attend at this specific time. So please understand that when you participate in the webinar or participate in the chat, you're agreeing for us to share that chat when we make the video available for those who weren't able to make it here today. So we really appreciate the ability to do this for those who can't be here with us in real time to watch the webinar later. So having said all of that, we really do want you to engage in that space. It's a really important community building space as we can introduce ourselves to one another and the organizations and the places that we care about. So I invite all of you to please go ahead and take a minute and introduce yourself in the chat. And please feel free to share email contacts. And it's also really helpful for Dr. Martin to have an idea of, who's joined us here today and, tailor her comments in your direction also. Thank you so much for being here and introducing yourself. And, kind of a reminder of why we're here. We're really focused in this webinar series on how to get food systems right in the long term. And so that means we really have to be addressing root causes of food insecurity and also looking for opportunities for food system sustainability. So we really need to understand what these drivers are for inequities in the food system and identify the opportunities for transformation. And that is exactly what Katie has done in her book. And so we are excited to have her here today. So, as Katie speaks about, COVID-19 has really exacerbated food insecurity and also health disparities. And, as I mentioned, just made more visible the inequities that were already there. But just now more people have seen it or have actually been pushed into positions of vulnerability that they maybe hadn't experienced before. And so, what we can have experienced in the last year is how important the charitable food system has been, of our food banks and our food pantries, but also how they can, respond to unexpected situations like we encountered this last year and innovate. And so we're really looking forward to learning more from Dr. Martin, as she puts it, looking for that paradigm shift from emergency to empowerment. So I think the very first question that I have for you, Katie, is really, what is the charitable food system? I use that term a couple times, and we have folks that are just joining us from all aspects of the food system. So perhaps you could just help us understand what you mean by that, and then we can talk about why that work is so important and critical at this time.
Great. Thank you, Robin, so much, and Wendy Sue for having me here today. And I'm glad you asked people to put their info in the chat. It's fun to see where people are from. Welcome. Thank you for spending part of your Friday with us. Yeah, it's really, I'm a big fan of starting with definitions of, as you introduce a topic of, okay, what do we actually mean by that? And what does that look like? So the charitable food system, I would say, is bigger than you probably think. And it involves food banks that work at the regional level. So typically multiple counties, sometimes a whole state. And the food bank is the collection and distribution center. So you can think of a very large Costco warehouse. If you were to envision what a food bank looks like, the regional food bank collects and distributes donated food, typically some purchased, some government commodity, to food pantries and meal programs that then distribute food directly to individuals around the country. And then Feeding America is the national organization that's based in Chicago. They have a small office that does more of their advocacy work in Washington, D.C. Feeding America has garnered a lot of attention this year, certainly because of COVID. They, I believe right now, are the second largest charitable organization in the United States. They convene the network of 200 food banks around the country. So the food bank where I work in Connecticut, Connecticut Food Bank-Foodshare, we recently merged as one statewide food bank. We are a member of Feeding America. There are 200 food banks as part of Feeding America's network. But it's interesting to also note my good colleague, Chris Costanzo at Food Bank News, has done some reporting on other regional food banks that are not part of Feeding America. And she estimates there are about 170 additional regional food banks. And I would say a very conservative estimate is that there are about 60,000 food pantries and meal programs that provide food directly to individuals. One thing it's interesting to me when we think about this work is very often people have experience of visiting a food pantry in their local community that may be based in a faith-based organization. Maybe it's on the backside of their church or in the community room in a social service office. And that may be their view of what the charitable food system is. And I think for a long time, people kind of disregarded the impact of the charitable food system of food banks and food pantries because you have this image of it being very small. And the notion was that people are just going very infrequently. And I love that we're at Food System Friday. So you guys are very familiar with what a food system is. And, typically when we think of food systems, where do people get their food? We think of grocery stores, we think of schools, we think of cafeterias and employee workplaces. And I would very much encourage you all to think of the role that food pantries and food banks play in that larger scope of our food system, because we know that millions of Americans rely on food pantries on a routine, chronic basis.
Yeah, thank you. So that's 370 formal, larger scale food banks, and then all those additionals, 60,000 food pantries. So, the scale and scope is significant for those who are less familiar.
And I would strongly encourage you, if this is new information to you, but you're certainly interested in food insecurity, I would highly recommend go visit your local food bank, go visit a local food pantry, preferably a couple food pantries, because when you've seen one food pantry. So visit a couple to see the variety. I can tell you they're located in nearly every community in the United States of America. There's a regional food bank that serves your area.
Yes, thank you. And so, Perhaps you made mention about having millions of people accessing food pantries and food banks. And so maybe you could just help us understand a little bit more about, why that access is so critical at this point in time. So, yeah.
Yeah, just some high level statistics. Before COVID, I believe the estimates were that about 37 million Americans were visiting food pantries and meal programs because they worry about having enough food at the end of the week or the end of the month. Some of the estimates were that it was closer to 50 million last year in the the hardest hit times during COVID-19. We saw a lot of new people who were newly food insecure. Um, and people come to visit food pantries for a variety of reasons. So sometimes it's when your food insecurity gets so severe, you've tried all types of other coping strategies. And when you finally get to the point where you're really struggling to get enough food for your family, you'll go and seek out what other help there is in the community. For some families, they are working and have assets that place them over the income eligibility for SNAP benefits. So, food insecurity does not discriminate. It impacts so many people who may be working, maybe, and even people who are receiving SNAP and having kids participate in school breakfast, school lunch. It's sometimes challenging to make all of the ends meet. At the beginning of COVID, when schools were closed and families couldn't rely on meals for their kids at school, like that's a humongous resource of how frequently, kids are eating, hopefully, meals for school breakfast, school lunch. And then that's all of a sudden not available. We saw huge upticks in need last year.
Yeah, so I think you just mentioned some of the kind of leverage points that tipped some families into food insecurity in this last year. But I think there are just lots of misconceptions about who is the food insecure, or who are those who are struggling to achieve self-sufficiency for themselves and their families. So from your experience and your perspectives, what really are some of those root causes of food insecurity? So call some of them out.
Right. Well, spoiler alert, it's not that we don't have enough food in the United States of America. A lot of the underlying root causes of food insecurity, they're rooted in poverty. It is, there's one statistic that really sticks out to me is the Federal Reserve did a study in 2017, so before COVID, that 40% of Americans would have a hard time with an unexpected $400 bill. So you think $400 is not a huge amount of money. You have an unexpected car repair, medical bill, some other challenge. 40% of Americans said that would be a real struggle. Now you'd put in the pandemic and people lose their job overnight. Forget living paycheck to paycheck. You're not sure when your next paycheck is coming. That's based on poverty. That is based on systemically low wages that have not kept pace with inflation. The fact that we have so many underemployed Americans who are working 1, 2, 3 jobs. And this is where employers often purposefully choose to hire folks just under full-time status so that then you don't have health benefits, you don't have family leave, you don't have vacation time, so that you need to patch together multiple jobs to make your ends meet. There's so many other underlying issues with poverty. Of lack of affordable housing is so huge. So often when I talk with food banks or food pantries, they'll mention, well, the issue in our area is really lack of affordable housing. And I appreciate that, but I say, sadly, that's in every community in the US, I think. I think it is just, that is one of the most challenging things. And when you think of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the foundation is, your basic, a roof over your head, a safe place to live. So when you're balancing, how do you pay your bills? You're going to pay your rent bill before you pay for your food bills. Housing is huge, lack of affordable healthcare, childcare, et cetera. But let me also point out some of the other systemic inequalities. And let's put in the list of root causes of hunger, racism. And, I think this past year, there have been so many, um, really big awakenings that we have had. COVID has exposed a lot of underlying systemic inequalities. It's widened our awareness about income inequality, about essential workers. But this has been a historic week with the conviction of Derek Chauvin. And let's just put that out there, of how the reason that people of color are more likely to be food insecure is based on a lot of historic racism that makes it harder for certain groups of people and certain communities of color to be able to get decent jobs, decent housing, decent water, decent food. All of those things contribute to why we have food insecurity in a country as wealthy and awesome and innovative as the US.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for calling attention to, that this week has been an historic week, but we continue to have much work to do. And, I think this might be an opportunity, because when we think about food insecurity and those root causes, right, what we tend to do is then we think about the people that are experiencing food insecurity. And I really appreciated in your book the level of attention that you gave about language and how we in the US speak about hunger, and then, of course, how that is related to how we approach hunger, or maybe it's the other way and it's cyclical, but we can get in some very useless cycles when we really need to be talking about how do we really work to transform food systems for the long term and address hunger. So I think I just really appreciated that section. So perhaps you could share some of your suggestions about language and how we speak about hunger and food insecurity, and some of the rationales that you have for how we need to be doing that differently.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, words have power, and we have to be careful with the words that we select. And within our charitable food system, the other thing that I would say in this massive, system of, let's say, 370 food banks and, many, many food pantries, is that we've grown and evolved over decades. So most food banks were started about 40 years ago, in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And they were started to treat an emergency. And the idea was that, oh my gosh, people don't have enough food. There's a whole host of reasons about that. This was considered the emergency response to hunger. That there were federal food assistance programs, namely SNAP, WIC, school breakfast, school lunch, that were the first line of defense against hunger. And then there was this emergency response that would be this short-term supply of food. And what is shocking to me is how we continue to use that language till today. So we describe very much in our websites, in academic research articles, still consistently. It's surprising to me that we continue to refer to this work as emergency. An emergency is something that happens. It's it's a shock. It's something that's unexpected, and it tends to be short term. Something that lasts decades, and our response to it that lasts decades is not an emergency. And so that's where I describe this work as charitable food system, even though that's not perfect because some of the food is actually purchased food. Some of the food is government commodity food. So it's not all donated charitable food. And there's some other issues, but I think the notion of emergency is just flawed. So I would encourage people to shift away from thinking of this as an emergency. Other key words that I think are outdated is the notion of feeding the hungry. I see this consistently on websites, on donor appeals, and the way that we as food banks and food pantries describe our mission to feed the hungry. There's a lot of things that rub me the wrong way. First, the idea of feeding. We're actually not feeding people. We're providing access to food, hopefully increasing access to healthy food. But we're actually not feeding other people. I think people are very capable of feeding themselves and they want to be able to feed themselves. The idea of the hungry is, I suggest person-centered language. So we describe the people who experience hunger or food insecurity is a more dignified choice of words. Even things like focusing on just pounds. Very often in our work, we focus on pounds of food. Sometimes we describe it in terms of meals, that there's a conversion we can do for, pounds to meals. I was on a call last week with Phil Trimble, who works at the Greater Cleveland Food Bank. And he said, we're really in the business of providing ingredients. And I like that idea, like we use the words pounds, pounds of food, meals worth of food. And I like the idea of, it's really, let's be careful about the words we use. Are we really just giving people pounds, or we're giving them ingredients so they can bring home and cook a meal for their family? Those are a few examples.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned some of the measurement. I think my head's in this. I'm teaching one of my classes right now, which is on impact measurement and project design, with the idea if you have your eye focused on how you will be evaluated and held accountable for your work, then perhaps, you put that same level of care into the design of what you're doing. And what my students are finding is that, those are required indicators often. So, our donors, whether they're U.S. government donors, they're looking at, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's McGovern-Dole Food for Education program, which is an international support grant-funded support for target countries globally. And those are required standard indicators: number of meals served, number of kilos distributed, and then accounting for the donated commodities in addition to, community contributions. So, when that's where my head was when I learned about your book. And also in your book, you speak a lot about how, so if we're designing our work with communities and with those who are experiencing food insecurity, and having to be in compliance with some of the donor set measures, and they're essentially setting how we will be evaluated. There's a lot of room for improvement in there. And so, I really appreciated some of the suggestions that you had and recommendations that you had for, how we might be able to measure things differently and what's really needed to tell the story of food security. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit towards that.
I have a whole chapter on, what gets measured gets done. And there has been critiquing within food banks nationally, putting some pressure on Feeding America to say, a lot of the metrics that we report to Feeding America are still really, really based on pure poundage. And, we have to report to our board of directors, and, we then are compared to other peers in the network based on pounds. if we want to shift, let's just keep it simple and focusing on nutritional quality of those pounds, then the metrics get more nuanced. And I'm really excited because there's some great movement happening. We have new nutrition guidelines for food banks and food pantries that is based on healthy eating research, national program from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So more food banks that are ranking their food. That's going to get us closer to not just saying we distributed 20 million pounds of food, but of those 20 million, this many were green, this many yellow, this many red, that it puts a little nuance to it. But I also think funders are really looking in this direction. So I think of like SNAP Ed work that's funded from USDA. It used to be a lot of the measurements and the metrics were, how many people did you provide nutrition education to? It is an output, right? We provided a flyer to 100 people at a WIC clinic. And therefore, we must have done good things because we talked with 100 people. Versus saying, well, what happened to those 100 people when they got that information? Did they learn anything new? Did they gain nutrition knowledge, information? What was the impact? And like really trying to shift more towards outcomes. We're looking at a lot of those similar things of how do we take this good work that we're doing and make it better? And how do we dig deeper to look more towards outcomes of what happens to the people who keep coming to our food pantries? I think there's a lot of room for growth for all of you researchers out there who may be listening. We need your help of really looking at what types of food pantry models are more effective than other models. So not just looking at who's at risk for food insecurity. We have a lot of really great data on that. And that's not, I don't think we need as much room there. It's more of what happens to the folks once they receive the food. And are there different approaches, what I think of as best practices that can help inform the work so that we can design food pantries better? Data can move mountains. It really it helps to inform the work we do, but you have to get out of the emergency mindset to think about taking the time to invest in evaluation.
Thank you. I can quote you to my students moving forward in that class when they're feeling frustrated. To say data can move mountains. So, and I know I'm making a little bit of a joke out of it just because I'm so excited to quote that to them. But it is true, which was why I so appreciated your making proposals for some of the different measures that are. What I really appreciated was that they were grounded in an understanding of the structural determinants of the factors that can limit people's ability to be self-sufficient. And so more on the developmental side of things, which is vocabulary that is used often in the international, food systems programming work that's done rather than the emergency transactional of the things that are distributed.
Yeah, well, and I think when we like in my book, I talk a lot about paradigm shifts, moving from emergency to empowerment, moving from a transaction of food, that short-term emergency, 3 days worth of food, towards a transformation of lives. And the way that we do that is really building relationships. So creating space within food pantries so that you can have volunteers and staff who get to know the guests that are coming and to understand what are some of those underlying complex issues that are likely rooted in poverty that this individual is struggling with. And then how can we help connect that person to other resources to tackle those issues that are likely unrelated to food? That's how we get into the transformational change, is helping to address the underlying root causes. That doesn't mean that a food pantry has to offer all of those services on site. It doesn't mean that the volunteers have to be experts on all of those issues, but hopefully they can be partnering with other community organizations and be really knowledgeable about who else in the community can support this individual. And then ideally, our long-term, the outcome we're looking for is helping to reduce the food insecurity, building self-efficacy, self-sufficiency, so the person doesn't have to keep coming back into the line. So I used to comment a lot, like, we've been measuring our success just by the numerator of providing more pounds of food to more people every year. And I thought, but doesn't that mean we're actually doing our job poorly? Like, shouldn't we be working on the, on the denominator of like reducing the amount of people who need food in the first place, focusing more on prevention? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So I think, maybe what I want to make clear to folks is that the tone that you've set in your book, but also in your own work, is not one of of criticism per se about the charitable food system, but it's more about like all of us, what are our weaknesses and what are the opportunities. So I wonder if it makes sense to talk a little bit about the amount of the number of clients that food banks and pantries encountered last year and served last year went through the roof. And so any of us, when we're under stress like that, that's when some of the weaknesses can start to show themselves. So really, how did the pandemic show some of the weaknesses in the charitable food system? But then also, how did pantries, for example, how did they address them? And you started talking to some of that just now, with the relationship based and working on the denominators while working on the numerators. But I wonder if you might speak a little bit more to like really, that was a lot of stress on clients, but then also on the volunteers, on the food banks themselves, on the pantries themselves.
Yeah. I try to strike a chord in my book and just in my work in general of recognizing and celebrating the good stuff that we do. There's a lot of good. I don't want to just harp on the problem of food insecurity, the problem that's wrong, but also calling out where there's room for improvement. Like, I know for sure we can do better on a lot of these things. And I think with COVID in particular, COVID has been just such an extraordinary time for all of us, that it really highlighted a lot of things that were already broken. It highlighted how we all knew there was income inequality in the US, but gosh, did we really see it for like, whoa, like how quickly people could go from, missing a couple paychecks to just really needing to go and line up to get free food. I mean, it's shocking. I think it also exposed for food banks and food pantries some of our own weaknesses. So I'll give you a really tangible example in our work in Greater Hartford. So in the city of Hartford, Connecticut's a very wealthy state. Hartford has some very high rates of generational poverty. So the city of Hartford is, has a lot of need. And on paper, there are a lot of food pantries in the city of Hartford. So, we go about our work and we have many food pantries and meal programs in our food bank network that we serve. And on paper, it looks like we're doing a great job in Hartford because there's plenty of need, but there's all these there's like 60 food pantries in a relatively small city. But then when you realize that of those 60, many of them are open one day a month or every other Tuesday for 2 hours. And now you have so many, you had all the same people who had been using these services in food insecure before the pandemic. And now we know there are all these new people who are in need. And many of these small food pantries are run by all volunteers, often retired senior citizens who had to stay home because they were at risk of COVID. So all of a sudden you have many of these food pantries that on paper, it looks like we're filling the need, and they've closed their doors. And it makes you think of, really, when we think about the food system and the network of food pantries in a community, I think it's our role, our responsibility at the food bank level to look at the types of access that people have within our network. And it really shone a light on how much room for growth. We also have superstar agencies that are open multiple days a week. They're open some evenings and weekends, and they provide like they're what I call like the anchor organizations, the community food hubs that provide many more things beyond food. But some of these smaller agencies, really are not providing the type of access and need that we would like. So then what happened was our food bank and many other food banks around the country stepped in, and we pivoted very quickly. And I'm pretty proud of the work that we did of recognizing, okay, at the height of it, I think 25% of our food pantries and meal programs closed. And so we created this drive-through distribution system at a massive football stadium in their parking lot where people could line up. And we created like this whole logistical operation kind of overnight. And I think that's one of the perks of the charitable food system is we're used to, changings in our food donations all the time. We're used to logistics and trucks and running warehouses. And so we were able to pivot pretty quickly. And for months, we operated a drive-through distribution 5 days a week where we were serving about 1,500 cars every day. Wow. So it shows you, the ingenuity and the ability to pivot as well.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that we've heard from others about, also, for example, the farmers markets were able to pivot. It was sort of like, now everybody has online ordering systems, for example. So there's some really positive, shifts that have happened in a lot of the components of the food system that we know are important for food system transformation. I think, are there other innovations that emerged in the last year?
Yeah, I think there are. One of my favorites was piloted by the food bank in Northern Illinois, and this started before the pandemic, which I always think it's just interesting to put it in context of when did all these start. So even before the pandemic, they were piloting a program called Order Ahead, so that clients. So typically, the way food banks work is food banks warehouse the food, and then food pantries within their network typically order online from the food bank for the food at the food pantry. And either they pick it up at the food bank or they get it delivered. What this program does is it's an ordering system for clients, for customers who are food insecure and needing food. So they can order online from the food bank. And so there's a whole level of client choice of being able to select the food that you want. Yeah. And really, really cool, innovative stuff is that you could pick it up at the food bank, but then they also got creative and thought of like, what are other dignified, local, convenient locations where people could pick up food, like the grocery store, and having like lockers where people could go pick up free food, but at the grocery store or at a library or at the school. I mean, just think of like how cool that is versus, unfortunately, often the stigma that's attached with, like we did a great job with this drive-through distribution, but still people were sitting in their cars and waiting in a long line to get to the front of the line to have volunteers put food in your trunk. Like we've served a ton of people and people are very appreciative of it. And I think we've done a really good job. But I'm sure a lot of people would probably prefer picking up food that's closer to home and not having to wait in line. So that's an example of some really innovative things that are happening.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think, there's a question that I have, and I know I've seen some of the folks in their introductions. I've just had a chance to look at glance at the chat a little bit, but, of course, we're big fans of all of our registered dietitians and those who work in nutrition education. As we think about not just, I appreciate you calling out the feeding aspect of it because, even in the definition of food systems as recognized by the Food and Agricultural Organization, I always cross out the word, fed. It has to do with all the components of keeping us fed, no nourished. Let's go with nourishment. And so this innovation that you just talked about, more empowerment around choice and being able to order ahead, and then also, more convenient pickup locations that don't create opportunities for those who inappropriately have feelings that stigmatize those who are accessing the services of the charitable food system. But what opportunities are there in that process, or just maybe in general, to really focus on that nutrition security aspect, right? So, with sustainable diets, that's diets that have low environmental impacts that also help ensure food and nutrition security.
Yeah.
And so, what have you encountered, or has that been an aspect of innovation in this last year that could enhance that dietary diversity, and nutrition security when people encounter the services of food banks and food pantries?
Yeah, this is a really exciting time nutritionally within the charitable food system. And I'll tell you why. So, um, Feeding America for a number of years has a system that's called Foods to Encourage. And, they took an attempt at identifying which foods are more nutritionally sound, but it was flawed on a number of levels, and they were really looking for another approach. And several years ago, I created a stoplight system called SWAP, which stands for Supporting Wellness at Pantries. And I work really closely with my colleague Marlene Schwartz at the University of Connecticut and other colleagues to pilot SWAP. And it's based on three nutrients of saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. And it's meant to be the acronym of SWAP is important because the P is really targeted at the pantry level. Because I was spending a lot of time at pantries and realizing I was, encouraging them to promote healthy food. And I realized that most of us don't know what the heck that means. And the food industry does a really phenomenal job of keeping us nice and confused and putting lots of crazy terms and labels on their food to make it look healthy, but it's not necessarily.
Yeah, I think you're getting lots of nods from
Yes.
our live, and also you'll get a lot of that. But please
Right. So I wanted a system that you could use at a food pantry if you don't have a nutrition background, if you're run by all volunteers, you may not have Wi-Fi available. What would be a really simple, transparent way that you could identify which foods would be green, yellow, or red? And so that's what SWAP does. And we've piloted it, and we have some really nice evidence to show that guests select more green and yellow food and less red food when they shop at a SWAP pantry, and food pantries are more likely to order green and yellow food from the food bank when they have it available. A lot of good stuff. Then 2 years ago, Healthy Eating Research, which I mentioned, funded by RWJ, they convened a panel of experts to create a nutritional system for the charitable food system because they knew SWAP was around, Foods to Encourage, there were some other systems. And I was really proud to serve as part of this panel. Marlene Schwartz and Hilary Seligman from UC San Francisco were the co-chairs. We had a bunch of nutrition experts, registered dietitians, and also food bank staff members like myself who could chime in and make sure that this is something that would be practical and feasible within a food bank system. So what was also really nice is we kind of used SWAP and the nutritional guidelines from SWAP as a foundation and then tweaked it. And so we've made some really nice improvements to our original nutritional guide from SWAP. So SWAP now is completely aligned with these new healthy eating research guidelines. Feeding America has adopted the new guidelines. We could I don't have a link here. We can get the link to folks, but if you go to HER nutrition guidelines for charitable food, you should be able to see the link. They were released a year ago, literally a week before the pandemic hit. We made the big splash, this announcement that these new guidelines are available. But there's so much interest in this work. So Feeding America is now encouraging all food banks around the country to use these new nutrition guidelines, and so that we can all be singing from the same songbook. And the thing that's really exciting to me is when we think about SWAP, it's definitely geared for nutrition education at the pantry level to provide healthy nudges and encourage healthy food at the food pantry. But it's also how we can think upstream and how we can use the guidelines with nutrition policies to encourage, nudge, cajole the food manufacturers who donate food to the charitable food system, and for all of us, so that we can encourage food manufacturers to not put quite so much sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar into our products, so that we can all be healthier and reduce health disparities.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that's a whole nother webinar about the dietary guidelines. So look forward to having you back. But it's encouraging to hear about many of these steps, and we also have evidence of research. I remember Hannaford rolled out their 5-star program, and it had similar impact to what you were describing. It really was found to influence choices that folks made when shopping. So it's great to hear that it's working well.
And it goes like the other cool thing too, when you're using SWAP with these guidelines, you can then gather data, and it's really great for metrics. And so you can pull data by your food donors and the grocery stores that are donating food, and you can see who are the superstars, and you can celebrate your champions, and then you can see where there's room for improvement. So there's a lot of interest in this, and I know you tend to have a lot of registered dietitians and others in Food System Friday. So there's so much room here for assistance and getting involved at the local level. I'm working with food banks and food pantries around the country that are interested in using SWAP, and it takes more time to rank food nutritionally than it does to take food and put it all on the shelf. So we could definitely use some nutritional expertise and extra hands at the local level.
Yes, so that gets to one of the questions that we had from one of our guests today. So she was or they were asking about the measurements, and how we do have to be accountable to what those who are funding the different organizations within the charitable food system. And so the question is, how can we start to change the minds of donors towards looking at different measures? And so we're back again to that measurement piece.
I actually think it's coming from the other direction. I think donors they're leading the charge. I think for a while now, donors, especially donors that have historically funded basic needs programs, is typically how we are classified with community foundations and other donors, is anti-hunger work at food pantries and food banks is typically considered a basic need. And, for a long time, we could say we served more pounds to more people, and they loved that and thought that was great. It's the funders, the donors, that I think are pushing us in the right direction to say, that sounds great, but we've been funding you for a while. We want to see what the impact of that is. So can you tell us more about your outcomes? So I think that pressure is coming more from the donor side of requesting more sophisticated metrics, outcomes. And then here's the challenge, is that I think within the nonprofit sector of food banks and food pantries, I work with a lot of folks that you don't necessarily have the research expertise to be able to do that kind of work. There's interest. So for those researchers on the call here today, we need your expertise to get involved. I think it's cool. There are definitely more academics that are getting interested in food security research,
Mhm.
and there's room for growth here. But I would really encourage more collaboration, so you don't have a graduate student, a professor, a researcher who says, hey, here's my hypothesis, and I'm going to go out into the community, gather data, come back to the university, analyze my data, write a nice journal article, hopefully get published, et cetera, at end of day. And you don't necessarily have a food bank staff or a food pantry saying, we should really do some research. Let's throw together some questions and we'll ask questions and we'll kind of analyze it and think what we think and have it. Wouldn't it be great if you could partner together? So at both sides, if you're in a university, if you're an academic looking to do this kind of research, reach out to your food bank, your food pantry, and ask them, what are the types of questions you would like answered? What are the type of studies that you would love to have done, but you don't have the resources or the expertise to do it? At the food pantry or the food bank or community partner level, if you have a research project that you're really hoping to focus on, reach out to your university and, ask them, hey, do you have some staff, some students that could help do this research? I don't think we do that enough. I spent most of my career in academia, and I was always surprised at both sides that we don't often know how to make that connection. And I think there's a lot of room for growth there.
Yeah, I agree, and hopefully all of my students are co-creating. I suppose we have systems in place actually to help ensure that that process is happening. But it's something that we have to be really deliberate about and very direct in communicating with our students about also, because I remember in my own work, working more directly on the practitioner side. Now I'm more in the academic side of things. I had so many students reach out to me wanting to evaluate my programs. I'm like, I don't know that. Do you have things that you are interested in learning about? Or how about you ask me what I'm interested in learning about? So, I'm walking into the academic side with a big old chip on my shoulder, having come from the practitioner side. But I hear that message, and it's an important message that we need to be co-creating.
And it takes more time.
Yes, it does.
Takes more time, and you usually are talking using different language. You have different expectations. So wading through that is sometimes tricky, and finding a really good community or university partner, it can take time, but when you build it, it can be amazing. It really, then you can do all kinds of really great work together when you build that trust and hey, we can do this work together, but it takes some time.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, so some of our folks need to, transition to their next set of meetings that start at the top of the hour here. And I've been trying to do my best to weave in the questions that folks in the audience have had for you. But I think if you're willing to stay on a few minutes after the top of the hour, maybe we can get to a couple more of those questions. Thank you. Because what I really want to ask you is, we've talked about some of the innovations that have emerged, and you've also spoken to, wouldn't we be great if we actually, wouldn't it be great if we were actually reducing the demand for services of the charitable food system? And so, I do just want to ask you, what do your hopes for the food systems look like in 10 years, 20 years? What's your hope for that?
Yeah. So I kind of paint that picture throughout my book. I introduce it a little bit at the beginning, and kind of chapter by chapter, I talk about kind of best practices within a food pantry setting. And I feel like it kind of crescendos at the end of like, if you put all these pieces together, I call it a community food hub. There's different ways to describe it, but I would see it rather than like the example I gave of, there are 60 food pantries in the city of Hartford, but they're not all created equal, and they're not all equally beneficial for the people when you're really needing food. My vision would be that the food bank takes a leadership role to say, we are going to invest and support and really put attention to the community food hubs, the anchor organizations that can be open multiple days a week with paid staff, paid livable wages with benefits, that are promoting healthy, nutritious food, having access to produce, but providing other wraparound services so that people are coming to get food, but they're also supported with the other issues to help them become more self-sufficient in the long term. Ideally, this isn't just about the food piece, though, too, that these are community spaces where people feel welcome and that they become advocates for themselves to move out of the food pantry line, but that they also have space to become advocates for their community. So these community food hubs are places where people can come together, build social capital, feel connected, feel heard, and then hopefully advocate for, what other changes need to happen in the community level that are going to make it such where we're preventing other people from needing food in the first place. That's my longer term vision.
Yeah, thank you. And I think many of us would have that shared vision of just, really it's the, there are certain kinds of, organizations and businesses that really, when they're founded, the goal is to, have them go out of business, right? Because you've met those needs, but also important in terms of having a social safety net. And I think, one of the questions that we had from one of our viewers is really coming from that human rights perspective and the right to food. And so really thinking about, when we talk about those who are experiencing hunger, what I'm inferring from their question is, what about talking about people's right to food and, possible violations of their right to food? And so, I just kind of wonder, in your network within the charitable food system is, what's the vocabulary around that and the perspectives around viewing, food as a human right, and then, policy advocacy around that.
Yeah, I think that is much more common in the international work, right? When we think about the United Nations, it's built right in there. And I think in the US, we've kind of chosen to overlook that basic right. I think there are a lot of things that we would say, of course, we all need food. I would say, I think many food bank and food pantry staff members and volunteers who commit their lives to doing this work, they do it for that exact reason, that I think they feel like this is just a basic right that people have to food. And the fact that people can't access enough food is an atrocity. That's why I come into work every day. There's a lot of passion around that, I think, but I don't think we usually use those words. Like, I think of that as the right to food. I think tends to be, it seems like either more in the international arena, or it's a little, I don't hear it a lot in the charitable food world, I would say.
Yeah. No, it is interesting because that is, that is the vocabulary and that's the framing.
Yeah.
Internationally. And it is interesting that we, the royal we, here based in the United States, choose not to use that framing. And I think that's yet another webinar. So I'm actually paying attention to, who it is that asked that question. So I think that's that's our next webinar. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I had a couple questions from folks who are, interested in your thoughts around, or learning if you encountered innovations around distribution. So you spoke about having the lockers available at the grocery stores, which I think is fabulous. But here's a specific question, that they would love to hear your thoughts on how the food bank network can innovate to tackle the barrier of transportation that many clients face. And there's another question about delivery. Delivery modes and mechanisms. So would love to hear, your thoughts and what you've seen.
Sure. Yeah. I think particularly there's been a ton of innovation because of COVID. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how this transitions and, transforms post-pandemic. A lot of groups doing home deliveries because they knew a lot of people truly weren't able to come out of their house because of COVID. I think what I hear in the network is like, I don't know that that's a super sustainable system. It's more challenging. I think for transportation, it's one of those issues too that I think predominantly in rural areas is a real hardship. You can be in other areas, in more urban areas, where transportation may not be top of the list. It may be utility assistance and utility bills being, a bigger challenge. So I think community by community, that's where it's so important to understand the local needs that you have. There have been some creative things that were done even before COVID of connecting folks with Uber or Lyft, of like maybe a family can get to the food pantry, maybe by public transportation or some other things, but then providing vouchers, working with Uber or Lyft to be able to get access for folks to get home when they have supplies of food. I think there are a lot of innovative things that we can try. And I would suggest, pilot it or figure out, can you build a relationship with a local group to do that? But it really depends on the community of how far people are from grocery stores, pantries, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
I think so there was another so this idea of forming relationships with either other public organizations or nonprofit organizations, but also companies. I think this next question is related. So, this is pointing out, the research that we know exists, and you spoke to it about the link between food insecurity and housing insecurity. And so the specific logic here is that when people are housing insecure, then you're also limited in the kinds of foods that you can prepare if you're having challenges with kitchen access. And then even if it's in the kitchen, then appliance and tool access and canned goods have limitations. If so this is from the person asking the question. Canned goods are only useful if there's access to the can opener, essentially. So kind of curious about your perspective on this. And so that was the question.
Yeah, that is a good question. I think it probably depends community by community. And I think, it's helpful, if you're working in a local community to do some kind of outreach, it doesn't have to be any formal research of just identifying, how much of a need is that. I know when I was doing a research years ago in Hartford, we used to ask, do you have a working stove, refrigerator? Do you have utensils? Those kinds of, appliances and needs. And that really wasn't a limitation that we found. There wasn't as much of that. And I think it sometimes depends on the population that you're serving also. So obviously, if you're working with families who are unhoused, people who are homeless, living in shelters, absolutely, that's a huge issue. If you're working with a food pantry population, typically it's folks that are housed and you're bringing home ingredients and food to then make meals at home. There's a food pantry I visited in Stuart, Florida, and they have a lot of really great stuff that they're doing. But one thing, they have a client choice food pantry. It's set up. It's really beautiful. It feels like a grocery store. There's a lot of fresh produce and refrigeration. They have this other little section that they have a homeless population that is close by, and they can, if you're part of that, there's a smaller group of people that they communicate, and they say you can come whenever you need to, you can come every day into the food pantry. And this little section of, and it's just, as you walk into the pantry, is the flip top cans and other things, so that they know if people don't have all of the kitchen appliances and set up, they could use these. It's also, they have prepared meals. So they would have pre-made sandwiches and a pop top. Like, this is for folks. And I'm not exactly sure how they communicate this to the food pantry guests, but I think there's this notion of, if you need these food items, then pick these up exactly when you need it. But if you're bringing these foods home, shop in the grocery area, so that, this is really for folks that have other more challenging needs. So I like that approach of recognizing there are certain people who may not have the can openers, they may not have the stovetop. How do we make sure that folks have food to just eat on the fly?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that I've really appreciated in our conversation today is how many times you said, this was being piloted before the pandemic. This was in place before the pandemic, and I think maybe this is a good place to close. Is a reminder to all of us that we don't know what we may be facing, and so it's important to have those partnerships in place, whether that's with researchers or whether that's with corporations or companies, and maintain those relationships with the donors, which is also, I think sometimes there's that mentality that it's us versus them, but my experience has always been one of collaboration.
Yeah.
Curiosity and collaboration. So I just really appreciate hearing all of your perspectives and you taking the time today. And I want to remind everybody that the book is available if you're curious and would like to learn more about the things that Dr. Martin spoke about today. So it's the Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries, New Tools to End Hunger. And so I think we'll pop the link in there one more time. You can get it from Island Press, and the discount code, I believe we popped in the chat also. But thank you to all of you who joined us today, either live or if you're catching this in a recording. I hope that this has helped you think and consider the charitable food system in a new way as we work to build more sustainable food systems. So just a quick reminder that we're back on the 21st of May for welcoming our guests from Conserve to talk about water reuse. And I just so appreciate you being here, Katie. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all of you who joined us. This concludes the formal portion of the webinar. And thanks so much for you taking the time out to learn more about food systems and food system transformation.